I'd say that architecture is still an autonomous discipline in the way that that got defined twice in the late 60s and early 70s. And its problem maybe comes from the fact that it's an autonomous discipline in two conflicting senses. So the original formulation of the concept of autonomy that we've come to inherit came out of Italy and was a question of political autonomy so an autonomy of a group of people who had no other way of seizing direct control over power, but an autonomy from the mechanisms through which the economy, society, and political power of their time was being organized. So it was a fundamentally Marxist movement that understood architecture, this tool that had been built to be the handmaid of power and the way that power found place in the world by encoding itself into the built environment. That tool, once it was no longer needed as the political and economic shifts towards capitalism left it behind, that this old tool of an aristocratic past suddenly was still available to be deployed for other means on behalf of the people who wielded it, something that hadn't existed before in the same way. That was the original formulation. When that arrived in the United States, primarily in the hands of Peter Eisenman, autonomy took on a different definition where the political aspect and the Marxist agenda was left behind, and it followed a more Colin Rowe style formal agenda where the autonomy was merely the freedom of formal creation and not an attempt to create an alternate political, social, and economic reality for the people who were its constituents. As much as Peter Eisenman likes to claim that he was not responsible for the arrival of the digital and the kind of formally generative architectures that came after him, we can say in the sense of his role in the creation of formal autonomy that these are nevertheless in some sense his children. And so we very much still live in a legacy of the possibility of acting in an autonomous fashion in the creation of form that was pioneered by Eisenman and his colleagues and friends in the early days of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Study, and just before that. I'd say that we should be careful on that definition because we could say that the whole possibility of autonomy in architecture arose from the reuse of a then irrelevant disciplinary structure. So that thing that seemed to be dead was only dead to the hands that used to want to use it. Once autonomy came into play, it's the very reuse of that seemingly dead discipline that became the possibility for architecture to act again. However, that's the discipline. The profession suffered changes that were possibly more dangerous. The attempt to reconcile these problems that were already visible in a much earlier date in the profession had first resulted in the development of the corporate practice in the 1880s and 90s in New York and Chicago that rapidly spread elsewhere. That kind of, and through architectural licensure practices, which were also developed by exactly the same set of architects at the same time, and also spread worldwide. These attempts to dig into the kind of professional ground that architecture got to control lasted and worked for quite some time. But we can say that the viability of the solution that they arrived at has grown weaker more recently, and as a side effect of the same problems that you're asking about and that you're describing. Remember that all of the design fields historically split off from architecture, that architecture is the only one that maintains such a strong presence of the academy in the agenda of the profession. This is true not only of the design fields, but actually of all the professional fields of scholarship, that none of them, not medicine, not law, not business, keep the academy so central to the power structure of the discipline as architecture does, and through that same formulation of the profession, that it's very difficult to be a truly influential architect now if you don't have a close relationship with academia and architecture. The idea that it's an ongoing question of research, a development of a long-standing and still evolving discussion, are core to the definitions of what architecture is and what keeps it as the maybe lead field amongst the cohort of fields that think about how we design the world in which we live. And so that aspect has become an absolutely necessary tool to continue to justify architecture's right to have a voice in the way we formulate the possibilities for the next stages of that world again and again. I think this gets to the question of heteronomy that you bring up, which is an idea that's mostly posited by people who believe in formal autonomy, but that became perhaps the basis for a whole branch of architecture that was kind of anti-formalist and obsessed with social conditions, primarily urban social conditions, that rose up as a kind of counterexample to maybe a formalist core coming out of studio practice, but also with a very strong presence in the lead of the practice. We saw battle lines as recently as 5 or 7 years ago where museums were all on that side. The journals were almost all on the other side, where the small galleries in the field were working with formal autonomy, and where the attention of public journalism was all on an idea of a social responsibility that comes hand in hand with this concept of heteronomy in architecture. Heteronomy was never the historic condition. It was not that there were many forces giving it its nature. It was that it was given nature by a single centralized force, or by a single concept of all the centralized forces together. So heteronomy kind of became a possibility as a sort of side effect of the development of autonomy. And I'd say that that side effect has had strong repercussions both in the practice and in the discourse. But what maybe, to me, is becoming interesting in the last couple of years is very new ways of returning to the possibility of the older concept of a political autonomy as a meaningful avenue for architecture to continue having agency in the world. Not strict heteronomy, and certainly not strict formal autonomy, but that other third path. We should never assume that architecture's interest in other fields is about those other fields' own questions of, within themselves. Architecture's agenda in philosophy doesn't matter. How architecture can use philosophical agendas to think about itself is the way that the discipline has worked. What we saw with the rise of Triple O was the chance for a group of young and increasingly established practitioners to justify a turn that they already wanted to make away from a focus entirely on the manipulation of the fields of relationships as the basis of formal design. It was fruitful for them because they needed a way to disengage what ultimately always turned out to be similar to the historic argument for functionalism, to disengage that from the way that they made formal designs in order not to be less functional, but to get rid of what was becoming an increasingly false claim of functionalism and let that live in other places in the designs.